Hey everybody, welcome to Shadow Mind Studios. Thanks for dropping by. I'm your host Travis Christian. In today's tutorial video, we're going to be starting our first video series of tutorials that are going to go over this entire hardware setup and describe for everybody exactly what the devices are, what each one's doing. By the time we get to the end of it, you'll know the ins and outs of everything that I do to compose and perform a live hardware set. That was the impetus for starting this channel in the first place. Was quite a few people asking me questions about my setup, just kind of had seen me perform with it and wanted to know how everything was tying together. I'd had other producers asking me, I'd had some listeners asking me, and I figured, you know what, instead of typing out pages and pages in Facebook Messenger to describe it all, I might as well just go ahead and start recording some YouTube videos. And that was kind of the reason the channel got started. So the first tutorial video series is going to be based around that, but there will be some other videos being released of live performances and things like that in between, just to kind of keep the channel interesting so that I'm not always just bombarding you with tons of information. To start off with, anytime you're going to describe any kind of a technical system, whether it's musical or software or something to do with engineering, building, architecture, anything, it's important to make sure that you have agreed upon nomenclature so that everybody knows that they're talking about the same thing. So the way I think about devices in my hardware setup is in terms of their functionality. And I think this is probably common for a lot of different producers. Everybody probably has their own unique way of looking at it. The way I tend to think of it is I think of functionality as being in four main categories. There's sound generation. So that's any instrument, your drum machine, your synthesizer, samplers, anything that makes a noise that then becomes part of the musical composition. Then you have effects functionality, effects being anything like delay, echo, reverb, filters, EQs, anything that takes the audio signal from an instrument and manipulates it in some way to cause it to sound different or hopefully sound better. Then you have what I refer to, or what I think of as being controllers. That's also a pretty common way of referring to these particular types of device functionalities. And that's anything like a keyboard or a set of knobs or what's also called a sequencer. So a keyboard tells the device what notes to play. A controller might allow you to control different parameters, so different aspects of the sound. You can see a lot of these devices are covered with knobs. Those knobs themselves are also considered a controller, but you can also have devices that are external that can control either the knobs you can see or also what you might think of as being invisible knobs or parameters that are sort of in the deeper menus of the device. And you might have external controllers to control those to make your life when you're performing a little bit easier. Then you have sequencers. Those basically tell everything when to do what. So it might tell a device when to play certain notes or when to trigger a certain drum hit or when some parameter change, when the EQ should go higher or lower, or when the volume should go up or down. There's a lot of different things that need to be controlled during a live set, and the sequencer kind of determines when those changes are going to happen, unless you're doing them manually. The fourth category of functionality that I tend to think of is mixers, and that's anything that takes multiple audio sources and combines them into fewer audio sources. Typically, it's going to be a single mixer that takes, whatever the sounds are. Say you've got 3 different devices or 4 different devices that generate sounds. You've got those running to a mixer, and then they get combined all into one sound, into the master track, right? And that's when you have, basically, you're taking all these different audio sources and combining them into something and turning them into a composition. So with that in mind, just keep in mind that every device in my rig, with just a couple of exceptions, falls into one of those 4 categories of functionality. The reason I say functionalities instead of devices is because I want to make it very clear that some devices have all 4 functionalities. Some devices only have 1. Most are some blend of both. Okay, so I've moved my camera to give a more bird's eye view of some of the devices in my rig. This is not all the devices that we're going to go over, so I'll have to move the camera again for you guys in a few minutes after we go over some of these devices. But the primary sound generation devices are all here, and that's where I want to start. We're going to go through the sound generation devices. Then we'll talk about the controllers. Then we'll look at the mixer. After we looked at the mixer and we start talking about the most complicated part, which is how it's all routed and how the controls are routed and all that kind of thing. At that point, we'll discuss a little bit more about some of the FX routing as well. But to start off with, we'll talk about these sound generators. So the first one that you see my left hand on here, this is the Electron Syntact. The Electron Syntact is what's called a groove box. A groove box is a device that typically has all 4 of the functionalities that I mentioned. So this device has sound generation on it. It has FX built into it. It also has ways to control everything that's happening on it. These buttons here are a sequencer, and it also has its own built-in mixer that is able to mix all of its different tracks together. It has 8 digital synth engines and 4 analog synth engines. It is mostly a drum machine, but it has a lot of really cool synth sounds on it as well. That's really what makes it a groove box, is that you can write entire tracks on it. Every element of the track can be done on the Syntact. You can have the Syntact function fully standalone and do some really cool stuff with it all by itself, nothing else involved. What I primarily use this for in my setup is for a lot of the drums. I do a lot of bass lines on the Syntact, and then a lot of ear candy and some synth instruments are done on the Syntact. Some synth leads, some different pads, a lot of really cool sort of trippy sounds that I like to use in my hardware stuff. I have a pretty signature sound when it comes to my hardware sets, which you guys will hear if you stick with watching the channel. And a lot of that signature sound I'm able to do on the Electron. This device here is the Roland TR-8S. So Roland makes really famous drum machines. You've probably heard, even if you're not a producer, you've probably heard of the 808. It's used by a lot of hip hop producers, and a lot of hip hop artists, have talked about it. I think Outkast had a pretty famous song, I know y'all wanted that 808. The TR-8S is essentially a digital version of the 808 with a lot of expanded capability. So it has the 808 drum sounds built into it. Then it has the 909 drum sounds, the 707, the 606. These are all famous Roland drum machines. There's samples from all of those on here. It generates using Roland's technology, analog modeled behavior, which uses digital technology to produce analog modeled or sounds that sound as close to analog as possible. And it has, for the 808 sounds that are on here, they are actually synthesized drums using that analog modeled behavior that is then routed through analog circuitry to do digital effects on it. You can see it also has a mixer here. So this device can also be considered a groove box. It also has its own sequencer. It's not as flexible of a groove box as the Electron. Like, there's not a lot of sounds that you can do on the TR-8S that are like full synthesizer sounds. The way that you can program notes on it is not nearly as flexible. It's not like playing a keyboard instrument. The Electron, actually, you can use these keys to play like a keyboard. With the TR-8S, you really just have to use the pitch control knobs to change the pitch of certain sounds. So it's a groove box, definitely. I mean, it's got 11 tracks. You can assign, all the different samples that are available by default onto those tracks, and then trigger them with the sequencer. You can also load your own samples onto it. And it's a pretty decent device. I'm not a huge fan of its workflow. There's some weaknesses with it and some things that I don't understand why Roland neglected those things or made the decisions that they made in some cases. That's pretty common with Roland, to be honest. They make really cool devices that there's always like a why did you guys do that type of question about things that have to do with it, even though it's a device that's nice to have. The way that the TR-8 is a little bit more flexible than the Electron is all the sequence patterns that you can create can actually be, if you're doing 16th notes on your sequencer, you can see there's 16 buttons on the sequencer. So that's an entire measure there, just like the Syntakt. But the Roland allows you to have 8 measures, and whereas the per pattern, whereas the Syntakt only allows you to have 4. The next sound generation device that we have is the TB3. This is another Roland kind of reissue device. It's based on the original famous Roland 303 synthesizer. It does have a sequencer on it, just like the original 303, but the sequencer is you do with using this keypad, this touch screen, instead of the old 303 had little buttons on it. And this, I mean, this is a staple device, the 303. It also has built-in effects. So when it comes to the device functionalities, the 303 here has 4 of them, or 3 of them. It has a sequencer. It is a sound generator. The sounds themselves, as you can see as I move through here, right, each one of these sounds sounds a little different. Right. So basically all the different sounds that you can get out of a 303 are here. And what that allows you to do, though, is instead of having to actually create the patch like you would on the original 303, it has that 303 sounds, the patches kind of already programmed, so you are limited to use only what's here. But you can see there's a ton of them. You know, you can go, I think there's 20 per bank or something like that. Let's see, 26 per bank. You know, 51 on the Bs. C goes up to 40 something, 40, and D goes to 17. So quite a lot of different sounds. Each bank, you know, each letter that's shown there, the D, the C, the B, the A, has different characteristics. And then there's different effects applied to each one, and you can change what we call as producers the wetness of the effect. So wet dry just means all the way wet means the effect is completely on, it's at 100%. All the way dry means it's off. 50% wet, 50% dry means the effect is there, but it's halfway there basically. And this knob here allows you to change that effect, to bring that effect in. So if I go to one of the C ones here that will make a good example, you can see if I just hit the button with this knob turned all the way down. Let me do this. And then if I turn that all the way up, you can see there's a delay on that, right? And then the effect is different on each one. And so using that, I can get a lot of different sounds there. I typically tend to just sequence this one. I don't always play it like this. I'm not going to get into how the sequencer works and all that kind of stuff on this video, but I did want to show you some of the differences in the sounds there. We have another Roland device. So obviously Roland's really popular in my setup. This Roland device is the JU6A. It is another Roland reissue. It's more of the analog modeled digital technology, and it is a remake of both the Juno 106, which is one of my favorite synthesizers of all time, and the Juno 60. And there's a switch here that you can't see in the dark probably, but there's a little switch here that allows you to switch between the Juno 106 and the Juno 60. And it has several patch banks. So it has, and when I say patch, if you're not a producer, what I'm referring to when I say patch is the different settings that are set for the device, which cause it to sound the way that it does. So I'm going to shine a light on this thing. So if you see here, this frequency and resonance envelope. So when you move this, you're changing the patch, right? And so you can save, well, 8 banks actually of 8 patches each. So what is that? 8 times 8, 64 different patches that you can have saved on here. There's some what are called presets, which are pre-made patches. You can overwrite those, or you can have your own. I typically tend to create my own patches on the Juno. It's rare that a preset sounds like what I'm looking for. I don't have a lot bad to say about this device, actually. I don't think really. I think Roland didn't do some of they managed not to do some of their typical Roland horse poop with this device. They actually really got everything pretty much right. It's a little bit limited in functionality, but the functionality that's limited doesn't affect me. Really, the only limitation to it is the Juno's a polyphonic synthesizer. And what polyphonic means, monophonic means a synthesizer that can only play one note at a time. So for instance, everything on the Electron is monophonic. There's 8 digital synths and there's 4 analog synths. And they're very powerful, really amazing sounds, but you can only play one note at a time. So if you're a piano player or a guitar player, you'll know what I mean when I say that means that you can't play chords on a monophonic synthesizer. A polyphonic synthesizer like the Juno or like my Oberheim there allows you to play more than one note at a time. The original Juno 106 was, I believe, an 8-voice polyphonic synthesizer. That means that it could play 8 notes at a time. This one is limited in that it only plays up to 4 notes at a time. You can chain 2 of these together to get more polyphonic quality out of it, but I don't need that. Typically with the Juno, it's rare that I wouldn't say rare. I do use it for pads and chords and things like that. But typically I do mono bass lines or mono synth lines on the Juno. So the fact that it's not full 8-voice polyphonic doesn't affect my setup at all. So this is a great device for me because one thing that you're always concerned about with all this stuff, you can see how much space it takes up, and this is not anywhere near all of it right now. So footprint is a big concern with a live rig. My footprint currently is way too large. I'm really looking for ways to slim that down right now, but the Juno is definitely not part of that problem. It's such a small device that makes such huge sounds and is capable of making so many different sounds. It's very, very versatile, and it's in such a tiny package. It's just really, really a great device for the road. This also has 3 different functionalities, just like the 303. This is a sequencer. It also allows you to select which patch that you want to play, but it's also a sequencer. There's delay and chorus effects built into it, and obviously it generates sound. So this is, again, everything except for a mixer is present on this device. The Oberheim here, probably the flagship device of my setup, along with the Electron. With the Electron's basically the flagship of the rhythm section, and this is the flagship of the harmony and the melody. This is a fully analog synthesizer. It's a reissue, a re-release of with a lot of improvements. It's a re-release of the original OBX or the OB8 or the OB6. It has the filters from the OB6, the OBX, and the OB8, and it has the oscillators of the original OBX. It's called the Oberheim OBX8. It is a phenomenal device. I absolutely love it. Let you guys hear what it sounds like. So, it's really, really quality analog stuff. If you've ever heard the Daft Punk Tron soundtrack, this was used very heavily on that soundtrack. At least it sounds like it was to me. And then this also, if you've ever heard Tom Sawyer by the band Rush, there's a huge kind of synth sweep that starts that song out. This is a remake or a reissue, really. I wouldn't even say a remake, since it is a lot of the exact same technology. But it's a remake of the device that made that sound that's in the beginning of Tom Sawyer by Rush. So very, very famous synthesizer, was very famous, very heavily used in the 80s. And it's just it's my favorite synthesizer. That's why I spent so much money on it. So that covers the sound generating devices. Okay, so if you hear sounds in my live set, whatever sound it is, it's coming from one of these 5 devices. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this episode up. We've talked about all the sound generation tools that are in the setup. In the next video, we're going to go over all the different controllers that are used to trigger these devices and to tell them what to do. That'll be the next thing that we talk about. Really appreciate everybody who stuck around and nerded out with me a little bit on all of this. Appreciate you guys listening and taking the time to let me show you a little bit of how what I do works. Thanks a lot. This is Travis Christian, your host at Shadowmine Studios, saying have a great one. Take care.